You're watching The Court Leader's Advantage, a video podcast for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. For decades, we court professionals have committed ourselves to the practice of diversity and inclusion. We make this commitment so as to earn the public's trust and confidence in America's courts. This dedication is ongoing. The work still continues. The goals of diversity and inclusion affirm our pledge to fairness, equity, impartiality, trust, and accountability. They also enhance decision-making, innovation, resiliency, responsiveness, employee engagement, and delivery of services. Courts are constantly confronted by the demand for more access, the desire for more equality, and the erosion of the very public trust and confidence that we have pledged to earn. What can we do to strengthen our core values? What can we do to use diversity and inclusion as a way to solve today's problems? And what do we see on the horizon for courts as they struggle to address diversity and inclusion on a daily basis? I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This is the second of a two-part discussion on courts and their commitment to diversity and inclusion. I'm joined today by my co-host, Zanelle Brown, Executive Court Administrator for the Third Circuit Court in Detroit, Michigan. Our panelists today include Marcia M. Anderson, recently retired as Clerk of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Western District of Wisconsin. Hector Gonzalez is the Court Executive Officer for the Superior Court in Tuolumne County, California. Norman Meyer, retired after serving 38 years as the court administrator in both federal and state systems. Most recently, he was the clerk of the United States Bankruptcy Court in the District of New Mexico. And Jose Octavio Guillen, retired after serving for 42 years as the court executive officer and jury commissioner in the superior courts of Sonoma, Napa, Riverside, and Imperial Counties, California. Thanks to all of you for joining today's video podcast.
We all know how important the support of allies are. Diversity and inclusion is heavily reliant on the support of allies who may not directly benefit from the specific diversity and inclusion strategies. Hector, what is the current support level of your allies? What has been effective in recruiting allies? And what improvements or further developments are you doing in this area?
Yeah, I would define allies in two ways. I would define them to be formal and informal. The formal allies are what we've been talking about in terms of community-based organizations, fellow justice partner agencies, other governmental entities like the county, town, municipality, chambers of commerce. Those are all the formals that often I turn to for a number of things, particularly for sources of recruitment to promote the diversity of the recruitment process. And I also recruit for jurors through those allies. The ones I probably would focus on a little more are the informal allies that may be a little more hidden. One of the things I do, and I think we all do, if we have communities where there is a congregation of particular groups of people of color, and I've lived in communities where we know where all the Mexicans live. Okay. Well, I go there and I talk to people, and I don't even tell them who I am or what I do. And I just, if I dress up, and Jose knows this, if we wear a tie and suit, I can walk by someone, and then the next day, if I come in with jeans and a t-shirt, they won't recognize me the day okay? Because the fact that I no longer have a tie and suit on made such a substantial change. It's almost like Clark Kent putting glasses on. Take the glasses off, he's Superman. Put the glasses on, he's Clark Kent. It never ceases to amaze me, and that is not only with people who are majority white Anglo-Saxon. Even among my own community, I've seen that they look at me differently when I have the suit on versus when I have the jeans and the t-shirt on. So I put the jeans and t-shirt on, and I go find my informal allies. I find the people that tell me, hey, have you ever been to court? How were you treated there? Because I got to go to court too. And then I get a lot of that information has to be taken with I wouldn't say a grain, I'd say a boulder of salt, but it is a very good source of informal ally and assistance and information that I think it takes a lot of work. But it's a good way to, one of the things I do with that is I usually find good Mexican food or good Cajun cooking. I've been to Louisiana and New Orleans so many times. I am a Cajun junkie. And so I like good Southern cooking. So I hit everything, you know. The one last thing I would mention, though, is I've also had the experience of being the ally. Before I became a court administrator, I was an attorney, a private attorney, who represented mostly farm workers and low-income Hispanics. And I was in a community where there was a propensity of a lot of crime by young Latino males. It was a farm worker community. And I was invited to a meeting with the mayor and the local chief of police and all the, a bunch of other bigwigs in this community. And it was actually in Central Washington where I started practice of the law. The community was called Wenatchee, Washington. It's in the center of Washington State, in the Cascade Mountains. It is the Apple Capital of America, was our official Chamber of Commerce title. Sorry, anywhere you don't grow apples in Wisconsin, or not the good ones. So they were having a community meeting about why was there so much crime among young Latino males. And they saw this as being like a scourge. And, I, having represented many of them, came to one simple conclusion. It was a community of men. This was a migrant farm worker community where the guys were coming in and working, and they didn't bring their families. And they didn't have the social network, the social bond that kept them, I think, out of trouble. And I told that to one of the police chief, and he didn't get it. He said, well, they should still behave themselves. And then I told him, because I come from a military family. Remember, we're all military, right? And I told him, were you in the military, sir? And he said, sure was. Do you know how your men are when they're stationed overseas? Have you seen some of those bases over in the Philippines or over in Okinawa, and how our service members act out there, particularly if it's just a large group of men and they have no other family connections to modify their behavior? How do they behave? And he said they behave pretty poorly. There's a lot of MP action going on. And I said, well, that's what you have here. You have a large group of men far away from their homes, far away from their families. They have no social connections to keep their behavior under control. They just go crazy. What you need to do is give them something to focus on. And I told you, it's real simple. When I ever go visit people's houses, all they want to talk about is soccer and what Mexican club is playing what other Mexican club, and is los tres van a ganar contra Colombia, And Jose knows the Mets. Well, I'm sorry, no eres mexicano, hombre. Los tres are the Mexican national team, the tricolors, because of the three colors of the Mexican flag. Okay. And so I told them, if you build a soccer field and let them play, then you're going to give them something else to do. And it only took, I told them, just get a little piece of park, build maybe 2 or 3 soccer fields, and have them open weekends and after work hours. You're going to see a big drop in the misbehavior that you normally see with guys just sitting around and drinking beers when they're in their 20s and 30s. And they actually did it, and they actually got a reduction in crime. Now, it hurt me as a private attorney. I wasn't getting all my clients. So I had to do a little more family law and civil law, but that was, to me, is the experience of being on the other end as an ally of the system has helped me be now. I'm not fighting the man, I am the man, in terms of that old saying, So that to me is I think the value of allies. I've seen it in both ways.
Jose, this question's for you. A sub-strategy of proximity, which is defined as having workers with different perspectives or social identities work closely together, can encourage some employees to make a choice. If exclusion is not within that organization's culture, then some employees should decide to leave on their own accord. Isn't this a subtle form of discrimination?
Uh, I see this as a case for courageous and credible leadership, perhaps more to do with exclusion, the type of culture that is created. And I think a courageous leader has to talk frequently and be anchored on the institutional values. You know, that they can frequently talk about that among their staff and in a practical way indicate why they're important. And so that, you know, the courageous leader also needs to have be able to lean into discomfort in those conflicts that will exist because we're human and we have biases. And so being able to have the courage to have the elephant in the room, to talk about it in a safe and supportive environment is key in holding people accountable and, you know, making sure that people are celebrated, encouraged to live up to the ideals. Ultimately, you know, we want the employee that if they choose to leave, that it be based on a conscious and free decision that the values of the organization are not in alignment with their own. That we don't want is that they want to leave because the place is not respectful of their values or that they are discriminating against those. To me, this is more about, you know, does the environment have the leadership, courageous leaders, you know, that support that kind of discussion because it's difficult. It's difficult and understanding why. Is people fearful of the change? So I think, you know, values and ethics matter. They have to be part of what is spoken every day and that you walk the talk, that you're credible in your actions, that you not say something, but you know, your actions are differently. So I see this as part of leadership and how you inculcate and create a culture where you know those boundaries and do it in a gentle, compassionate, but courageous way.
Very powerful statement on leadership. Go ahead, Norman.
Jose, you just hit on, you know, values and accountability, and those two things that really struck a chord with me. And yeah, you know, inculcating your organization with the values of the organization and what your personal values are as a leader is so crucial. And one thing that I think that it needs to be carried out in an area of strategic planning. That if you're making strategic plans for the future in any area of the court, you know, whether it's IT or public service or space and facilities or whatever it may be, that you are including and honoring diversity and inclusion practices inside your strategic planning. It isn't just an adjunct over there in its own topic, that you imbue all of your actions, all of your planning and your leadership actions have to honor diversity and inclusion. And then if you do that, the whole accountability thing, yeah, if an employee isn't willing to be part and parcel of that, if they're not willing to buy into what the organization is about, yeah, holding them accountable for what your values are is important, because if you don't, then you're just tolerating and completely undercutting what you're trying to accomplish. And so I've done a lot of work in teaching and research on, you know, performance appraisals and such, and there's a lot of accountability included in that. So how you measure how somebody is doing needs to also honor diversity, inclusion, and whether or not that employee is also adhering to the values of the organization.
Hector, what diversity and inclusion strategies are being developed in your court and implemented at this time? Has the focus changed since COVID-19? And has the recent wave of social justice protests and demonstrations impacted those?
We're in a part of California that has gotten probably very little impact from COVID. We, as recently as like a couple of months ago, had less than like 10 cases in the entire county. We've significantly increased over the last 2 months. So in terms of the impact of what we do for diversity and inclusion, COVID hasn't had as much impact here. I mean, other than we do things more by a remote presence for meetings and in terms of what we do with our court customers and social distancing and other protective measures. What I do see, though, more of an impact is I think the social unrest and protest that I believe causes some division between our staff in terms of generational divisions, the older versus the younger staff. And in particular, I think one of my strategies has always been that diversity and inclusion also includes age. And I don't mean just in terms of the age discrimination in terms of the older worker, but I also have seen that in the reverse in terms of a very strong, I think, hesitation bias against hiring younger employees, particularly women, because they're going to get married and they're going to have babies. And, you know, we should get someone who's already had her family and isn't, you know, going to disappear on us as soon as she gets a boyfriend. And yes, I've had court managers and supervisors tell me that, and I go la 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 la. I do not want to hear that. I'm a former, you know, employment law discrimination attorney. You were making my case if I was going to sue us. And so, in terms of the social protests and demonstrations have bringing out this distinction in ages, and it also has an impact, I think, in some communities because your younger workers are going to be people of color. And I worked in a community where most of the people under 30 were Latino. That was in Mono County, Mammoth Lakes. Everyone over 30 was predominantly white. So this ageism, when you have this division created by, you know, social unrest, it raises its head. And in my strategy, as I said, is I've always tried to promote as part of the diversity and inclusion those who are younger, those who are in their 20s and 30s, because I do believe that's another aspect of diversity that's often missed is the generational experience. Yes. And I know I fight a big fight because I often have my middle managers and my upper management staff who are usually going to be in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who have little trust or little regard for persons in that age group for any number of reasons in a professional setting. So it's, in my mind, though, it's one of the most important aspects of diversity and inclusion that gets overlooked.
And you're right, we do have to pay attention to it because in a few years, they're going to be the majority in the workforce. Definitely. Marcia, what about you? How's it going over there in Wisconsin?
Well, I live just outside the state capital, which is Madison. So I'm just barely outside the city limits. We did have some unrest downtown, and the federal courthouse is located right near less than a block, I'd say a block and a half from where some of the unrest occurred. And there have been some, according to my successor in my position, there have been some protests because some of the protesters were identified via cameras and other means, and they decided, the U.S. attorney decided to file federal charges. So some of those individuals ended up getting arraigned, obviously, in the district court, in the same building where the bankruptcy court is. And so there were protests. They were peaceful. But I think, you know, being as I think a lot of court are in center of cities or in areas where these kinds of things occur, or they have populations that are changing, the demographics are changing. I think this is a moment that we need to seize. I think we need to look at policies that we have in our court systems that may have a disparate impact on different groups of people. I mean, one thing that comes to mind was some of the policies in terms of fines and penalties that were assessed in Ferguson on the African American population. They could not afford to pay those fines that kept rolling up and increasing. And so then you'd have a bench warrant issued for someone's arrest, and then at some point someone's now got something on a record of some sort. So I think we need to take a look at some of our policies and find out, similar to what Norm was talking about when you're hiring people, what's the reason for this policy? Is it really there to deter people from speeding, or from double parking, or from having code violations on their home? And find out whether or not, again, that the impact is disproportionately on certain people and puts them in a position where they can never dig out of that hole. And because that also creates a perception of the courts, I think, in certain communities as being out to get them, as being unfriendly, being hostile, and making their lives in general miserable, and when they're not good to begin with. So I just think this is a time for us to take a look at some of those policies, and judges can be involved in that as well, because again, they're the ones conferring sentences on people, and they maybe need to think, what impact will this have? Is this really going to be a deterrent, or is this going to send this person off the rails and set them on a path where their life is never going to get better, and again, they're going to harbor a lot of resentment towards the court system.
Marcia, we're going to go back to something you mentioned earlier. It's about changing the staffing model and hiring approaches to provide opportunities to wider groups of potential employees. You mentioned the conversion to telework, especially for rural communities. What's holding courts back? Why aren't we doing this?
And I think it's just about comfort. I think with the social justice protests now, maybe people will start to be more introspective. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that more and more citizens are embracing technology. They find it convenient. They don't have to make the trip to the courthouse to pay something off or to file something. And I think we need to revisit our position descriptions, because they may have been heavily weighted towards foot traffic that in some places has decreased significantly. I know it did at our court here in Madison. And look at workflow as well, to try to find ways to provide services that are efficient, because that's our job. We should be trying to find ways to be more efficient and responsive to the people that we serve. And if people are now getting more comfortable with ordering their groceries online, they're more comfortable. I mean, I have friends who are now like, I don't know why I ever go to the grocery store. Why did I go to the grocery store in the first place? They love being able to order their groceries and get there and pick them up and put them in their car. And so there's just all kinds of things that we're doing now with technology as a consequence of this pandemic. Telehealth, people are no longer making trips into doctor's offices. So again, how do we look at our staffing model? How do we look at our workflows and the way we provide service to our customers, our fellow citizens, that makes their lives easier, that provides them still with the contact and the service that they need? You can still, I mean, it's amazing the things that we can do now. Shop, as I said, entertain ourselves online, learn new things, visit with family members. As people have told me, there have been so many Zoom gatherings with family members now that they're thinking, why do we keep having those, annual big gatherings when we could all gather every weekend and do something together? So I think we have to look at our models, look at our way we do business, think outside the box, embrace the technology, hire younger people who may ask those kinds of questions, or they're the ones who can help us figure out how to do this more efficiently. For us old heads who are still trying to figure out, like my husband, how to use his Zoom camera. So we have to give them the space and the freedom to make suggestions to us for these kinds of things. And I'm a big proponent, and I was when I was a clerk, of having staff members work on a task force, because as I would tell them, I am not the smartest person in this court. We collectively are. So I would have them volunteer for a task force when we went from paper to online filing. They're the ones who came up with the workflow because they do the work every day. And I wasn't going to try and figure it out. And they came up with some really interesting ways to make their work more efficient. So again, trust your staff, trust your newer and younger employees, and let them help us be better.
Awesome. Jose.
It's the pandemic really, kind of pushed us into this disruptive world. We didn't have a choice. We didn't have a warning to that extreme change. I just got over burying my mother, who, the entire family was struck by COVID. And little things that we take for granted, like funerals, coming together as humans and mourning. This COVID, the pandemic has changed those relationships, those processes. And so it's a matter of seizing those opportunities. The world has changed as we know it. And most likely, it won't go back to the way it used to be. And so I agree with Marcia that, how do we harness and seize the opportunity? But we also have to think holistically about, other unintended consequences. Sort of like, okay, so what about security? And how about cybercrime? And are those computers, secure? What are the protocols for making sure that, there's security maintained in our records? That is at the core of what we do, to produce the records. This notion that, we try to inculcate the sense of teamwork, this sense of community within the court. How do we maintain that? How do we find a new way a substitute, if you will, to create this need that is part of the human condition of wanting to be with proximity, with physical connection. The notion that, justice starts with a smile at the counter. Well, if you're wearing a mask, it's pretty hard to show your smile. This social distancing and the ethical issues, and the access to them, and in California, for instance, in the labor relations, in an organized labor environment, there are some labor relations issues that you have to go through it. So access, meaningful access, opportunity, we have to seize those opportunities because, we can't go back to the way it used to be. But we also need to go beyond that and say, holistically, what substitutes do we have for team building, for security, for access, meaningful access, for inclusion, and not, substituting one level of inequity for others. Creating others. So I agree with Marcia that this is a golden opportunity to seize opportunities that, we didn't have before, and technology presents a really good way to do that. And at the same time, we need to think about all the other components that we probably have not fully comprehended yet.
There's a lot of work.
Zanelle, I'd like to add something a little bit more. First of all, just to say that what Marcia and Jose just said was just really profound, and I appreciate that. That I think we are on the cusp of, I don't know what the right term is, of a sea change, a turning point in history, because we have the confluence of two major movements. One is the response to the COVID pandemic and the incredible effect it's having on the social fabric of the world and the economy of the world, and the courts are caught up in it, and we're responding to it in many creative ways. And as I think the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court has been quoted many times as saying, this is a tremendous opportunity for the courts to get off our butts and get into the 21st century and leave the 19th century behind. And it is time for us to shed the old ways of doing things, old ways of thinking, embrace the new reality and move forward. And at the same time as all of that's going on, we have a tremendous movement and pressure and to respond and deal with racial injustice and systemic racism in society, and that's the protests that I think that we've mentioned here already. And here in Albuquerque, we've had some very big protests and even some violence with a shooting involving a right-wing militia group as well as the counter-protesters. And so it's all over the country and it's all over the world. I communicate a lot with people internationally because of the network of people I've developed over the years, and it is profound how this has sparked, the events in the United States have sparked similar protests and similar cries for justice in many, many other countries. And so to get back to where I started is we are on the cusp of a huge change in the world around us, and the courts are already responded and are going to respond a lot more. And I almost wish I was 30 years younger and working in the trenches, because this is just so exciting as a court leader to say, wow, I can be part of this and I can make things happen. And so here we are, but I'm doing my bit to try to move the ball down the field on this one. So that's the challenge to our current court leaders and future court leaders, is to seize the moment, seize the moment.
I echo what all of you have said. It's definitely the moment for real change right now. It's an opportunity for courts.
That is a great segue to our last question as we close out this episode. What do you see on the horizon as courts address the issue of diversity and inclusion? Jose?
I'm very hopeful that, the current existential challenges will also provide new and better solutions to existing problems. And I believe that it has to start with an individual, the introspection and the reaffirmation of what are the core values, that we believe in. And this could be at the fundamental level of how do we define our own golden rule individually, and how do we want to treat others, and understanding that that's the commonality, is that we have to transcend beyond the labels, the rhetoric, the divisiveness that we're living through. That is really undermining this whole notion that it's okay to have disagreements, it's okay to have different perspectives, but the bottom line is that we are all humans. That the commonality of that and the treatment for that, I think it's critical for us to focus on. I think of this as a shift in what defines our Western society of individualism, individual rights, individual freedoms, and moving to a more communal perspective. That by caring of others, we're actually caring about ourselves. I like Gandhi's message and quote that said, to truly find yourself, you have to lose yourself in the service of others. The biggest challenge for me is really managing the vast amount of information. We're bombarded with this information. And what I'm finding is that probably what we need is less information, more mindfulness, more introspection, and to recognize that, there's more that holds us together. When we start thinking about others in the sense of humanity, that people, and research has been done on this, that, the more we think about others in the sense of human, what kind of vegetable do you like? If I can think about that about you, I just elevated you to my level of being human. And so I am hopeful. I think of diversity and inclusion as, I term it idea. which is a process of inclusion being the way we're going to go about including others. Diversity is the outcome by doing that. But then we want to go beyond diversity, not just being at the party, not just being at the table, but actually having meaningful equity. You know, the outcomes are not dependent upon some predetermined characteristic. And A, for awareness. Awareness meaning that we have to be introspective, we have to be mindful that our actions, what we say, think, and do matter, and that they do reverberate in organizations and relationships. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that the next generation will learn from the mistakes we made and make it a more inclusive and more fair and equitable world.
Marcia, what do you see on the horizon?
I was just sitting here thinking that, the courts are the one thing, at least the United States courts, are mentioned specifically in the Constitution. But I think we're part of something very special and important in this country. And whether you're a state court or a federal court, for many people, their only contact with the justice system or some kind of part of the justice system is when they come into a clerk's office and they may never ever appear in front of a judge, but they're going to be interacting with our staff. And so I think that gives us a responsibility to look like America, to provide an example of people working together with different backgrounds and religions and beliefs and cultures that can work together to help administer justice. I would personally like to see the bench be more diverse, but you take one step at a time. But I think having our offices diverse, welcoming, inclusive, provides an example. It leads the way. In the military, we always talk about leading the way. And I think this is an important place where we could lead the way and set an example. And also, I think be part of the discussion as we talk about things like bail, as we talk about, rates of incarceration for certain crimes, for certain groups. I think we're opening up those discussions and we're going to be part of them. So we need to be ready.
Norman, what's your take?
Well, I kind of shot my wad on the last question, but frankly, I just see there's just tremendous opportunity to do the right thing and to uphold the core purposes and responsibilities of the courts. And Jose has been hammered on that one today. What our core values are, and Hector and Marcia have touched on it as well. I sort of like to just pass on a personal story. My grandfather was elected to the city council of Mankato, Minnesota in 1914. And when he was elected, he said the following phrase: "I have accepted a public trust and I will keep the faith." And he passed that down to my father, who had a tremendous career and trying to live up to that standard. I will accepted a public trust and I will keep the faith. And if you were to talk to the staff in the courts that I worked in, I use that phrase a lot, we are here to serve the public and uphold the faith they have in the third branch of government, to be fair, to be just, to uphold equality, and to have diversity and inclusiveness be inside of every act that we do. And we are being watched. You talk about walking the talk. Everything you do, people are watching. And so you need to, my message is to the people in the courts now and in the future is seize this opportunity, seize what's going on today, and just make it better than ever it was, and make sure the public maintains faith in us to do the right thing.
Hector, what are your thoughts?
I kind of see a unique perspective because not that long ago, I was an adjunct professor teaching political science and history at our local community college. And I had to give it up because the court needed all my time, particularly now with all the major projects. But what I saw was what I think I see in the court setting is we're having a generational shift coming. Our baby boomer leadership, both at the middle management and the upper management, I mean, that's us. Except for you, Marcia, you look pretty. You look like you're Gen X and not baby boomer. But the point that I'm making is that we're going to have diversity and inclusion, I think, occur through what I would call a natural progression. But whether the values, the core values, like Jose points out, flow with that is what I'm concerned about. Because unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of young people in different parts of the country that, for whatever reason, are holding fast to racist, biased points of view. And it's kind of like a counter to what you would expect, because I've had a lot of instances where I taught my students the generational shifts in perspectives about major social issues. A good example is the attitude towards homosexuality. As little as 20 years ago, the majority of Americans considered it to be something amoral, and in many places still criminally wrong. Well, that shift just recently has gone completely in the opposite direction. Obviously, the majority of Americans now have no problem with homosexuality and even with same-sex marriage and the recognition of rights for the LGBTQ community. But that doesn't mean everyone has that core value. It just means that the mass of our generation is finally making that shift. And I think that's going to happen in our courts in terms of our new leadership and our new workforce is going to be, by the weight of the change in population, going to be diverse in itself. Whether that leads to greater inclusion is the point, because remember, we do know the difference between, as we were saying, you can be invited to the dance, and you're in there, but are you going to be able to dance? Are you going to be a wallflower just standing by the table looking at everybody else get all the opportunities to dance? And I'm hoping and counting on what we've been able to do will help that, as Norman said, and Jose, the next generation take the advantages that they're going to have in the greater natural diversity that's going to occur, and make sure that the inclusion comes with that. That, to me, is the future challenge that I wish I was around too, Norman. Another 30 years, and that retirement would sure be sweet if I could do that.
Zanelle, what do you see on the horizon for courts?
Pay close attention to that public trust and confidence that we're supposed to build, and that excellence in service. Right now, we're seeing that courts do not have to operate the way that they have in the past due to the pandemic. We are realizing all pieces don't have to be where people are traipsing down to the court, paying for parking, having a face-to-face interaction. So what can we do differently? Also, you have to be careful to make sure that is anybody being left out of that process even right now. So I see that courts are going to be more in tune to what's going on in their environment, paying closer attention to the technology, with employee engagement, having the conversations that really ensure that employees feel welcome in the space, because once they feel welcome, they can make sure that the public feels welcome. So I really think there's going to be a lot of progress as far as diversity and inclusion goes if people are committed.
My thanks to Marcia, Jose, Norman, and Hector today for sharing their thoughts on diversity and inclusion. My thanks also to my excellent co-host, Zanelle Brown. And of course, my thanks to all you court professionals out there watching this episode. Despite all the challenges you face, you keep the courts running. All of us thank you. Do you have a question or comment about this month's episode? Do you have an example of diversity or inclusion within your court that needs to be shared? Email us at CLApodcast, that's all one word, at nacomnet.org. We'll try to include your comment on a future episode. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. This episode appears in both a video and audio format on the NACM CLA podcast landing page and on the Court Leader website. So until next month, I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on the NACM website, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, at nacmnet.org. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leaders website, and the National Association for Court Management, have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily reflect the position of the National Association for Court Management.